7:42 a.m. The night's rain still clung in long streaks to the blue-tinted glass of the Ellison Tower. Below, the city looked cold and hazy, like a photograph not yet in focus. A row of supercars parked before the main entrance reflected the stark white light of the building's facade, where the SterlingGate financial logo glowed above the boulevard, a declaration of power. Victoria Harlan stepped out of the 31st floor elevator without a word. The sound of her heels echoed evenly on the dark stone floor. The rhythm was slow, precise, absolute control. Her first day as CEO, the air in the operations center seemed to freeze the moment she appeared. 27 massive screens covering the north wall displayed millions of financial transactions running overnight between New York, Zurich, Dubai, and Singapore. Flickering red and green numbers reflected off the cold metal ceiling. The central air conditioning hummed softly overhead. A spoon left in a paper coffee cup tapped gently against the rim with every slight vibration of a desk. No one fully stood. No one knew whether to look at their screens or at the woman who had just entered. SterlingGate wasn't a typical fintech company. It managed the high-end payment systems for private equity funds, VIP banking clients, and corporate transactions worth tens of millions of dollars an hour. Last quarter alone, SterlingGate had processed over $900 million in international transactions for luxury clients who flew first class and slept in five-star hotels in Manhattan or Geneva. And Victoria had been hired to turn this company into an even larger financial empire. She was only 36, brilliant, precise, ruthless in her work. The board loved that. Victoria stopped in the middle of the room. Her gaze swept over the clusters of employees sitting at their monitors. The air smelled of stale coffee and hot metal from the servers that ran all night. A few of the engineers avoided her eyes. Then she saw Ethan Cole. The man was slumped asleep at the end of the central row of desks. One of his arms was still resting on the keyboard. The monitor in front of him was filled with lines of code and pale yellow system diagnostics. His gray-blue button-down was so wrinkled it looked like it had been balled up in the trunk of a car. A cold cup of coffee sat next to his hand. The rim was stained with the dried, hours-old fingerprints of coffee. Victoria stood motionless for a few seconds. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Nearby, Claire Donovan tightened her grip on her pen. She knew Ethan had been there for almost 2 straight days. Almost the entire team knew, but no one said a word. Victoria turned to Mason Reed, the director of operations. "Who is he?" Mason hesitated slightly. "Ethan Cole, senior infrastructure engineer." Victoria glanced at Ethan again, then at the Rolex on her wrist, 7:43. "On my first day of taking over this company," she said, her voice quiet but sharp, "a senior engineer is asleep in the middle of SterlingGate's most critical operations center." No one answered. A monitor behind Ethan flashed a yellow warning. System latency warning. Then it vanished. Victoria stepped closer. She didn't look at the screen, didn't ask what was happening, didn't ask how long Ethan had been there. The only thing she saw was an exhausted man, asleep at the helm of $100 million financial empire. To her, it was an image of weakness. "Wake him up." No one moved. Claire swallowed hard. "Ma'am," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "Ethan's been on shift 4. Victoria turned to look at her. Just one look. Claire fell silent instantly. Mason stepped forward, touching Ethan's shoulder lightly. "Ethan." No response. Mason's hand was firmer this time. "Ethan." The man jolted slightly as if pulled from a sleep too deep. He opened his eyes slowly, taking a few seconds to register where he was. The red impressions from a keyboard were still pressed into his cheek. He looked around. His gaze landed on Victoria. The room was dead silent. Ethan straightened up, a little stiffly. His shoulders were locked up, like someone who'd been sitting in one position for too long. He reflexively glanced at his primary monitor before looking at the person in front of him. "Sorry," he said, his voice hoarse. There's no need for an explanation." Victoria cut him off. Her voice was just quiet enough that the entire room had to fall silent to hear it. "I don't know how SterlingGate operated before, but this will not continue under my watch." Ethan blinked a few times, trying to keep his mind clear. He hadn't slept more than 90 minutes in the last 2 days. Behind him, a yellow warning flared on another screen, then vanished just as quickly. Claire saw it. She knew Ethan saw it too. Victoria didn't. "You were sleeping during work hours," she continued, "in the middle of the company's most critical financial operations center." Ethan opened his mouth to say something but stopped himself. There was a brief silence. The steady hum of the air conditioning filled the space above. Then Ethan said quietly, "The Western system has had a memory leak since last night. I've been keeping the processing cluster from crashing." Victoria crossed her arms. "And your solution was to sleep?" No one dared to look at Ethan. No one dared to look at Victoria. Ethan rubbed his eyes. He tried to remain calm, even though his head was still throbbing from the lack of sleep. "I've been here for 46 hours, Victoria almost scoffed. "That's not a badge of honor." The words fell into the cold room like a thin blade. Claire lowered her head. A young engineer in the corner tightened his grip on the handle of his coffee mug. Ethan didn't react right away. He just looked at Victoria for a few long seconds. Not angry, just tired. The kind of tired that other people can't really understand until they've lived it themselves. Victoria turned to Mason. "Revoke his access." The room went silent. Mason hesitated. "Victoria, maybe we should right now." The tension was so thick you could hear the hum of the server fans behind the glass wall. Ethan sat motionless for a few more seconds. Then he glanced down at the old Casio on his wrist. 8:03 a.m., his gaze lingered there longer than anyone expected. It wasn't about the job. It wasn't about being fired. He had to pick Lily up from school at 3:15 p.m. He couldn't be late again this week. Ethan slowly unclipped his employee badge from his collar. The lanyard was worn. A smiley face sticker Lily had secretly put there was still stuck to one corner. Victoria saw it but said nothing. Mason took the badge as if it carried some impossible weight. Claire said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her. Claire wanted to say something, maybe an apology, maybe don't go. But in the end, she remained silent. Because at SterlingGate, everyone learned to stay quiet to keep their jobs. Ethan stood up. His back was stiff after nearly 2 days never leaving his chair for more than 10 minutes. He pulled on a dark jacket with frayed cuffs and picked up his old laptop. No one stopped him. Victoria stepped aside to let him pass, as if this were just a necessary procedure. A security guard appeared near the door. Too quickly. As if this had all been decided beforehand, Ethan walked past the rows of blinking monitors, their amber glow reflected off his tired face. As he neared the door, a small alert appeared in the corner of the central monitor. Off diversion cluster D. Yellow, it flashed twice, then turned red. Claire's head snapped up. The color drained from her face. Ethan saw it too. He paused for a single second. Just one. Victoria didn't notice the alert. She was signing something on a tablet her assistant had just handed her. Ethan gave the red screen one last look. Then he walked out of the operations center. The glass door clicked shut behind him, like the sound of something just beginning to fracture. The rain hadn't stopped when Ethan Cole left the Ellison Tower. Long streaks of water slid down the blue glass of the 47-story building, where the SterlingGate financial logo still glowed coldly over the boulevard, as if nothing had just happened. People still walked into the main lobby with expensive umbrellas and perfect suits. A silver Aston Martin pulled up to the curb. A doorman bowed, opening the car door for a private banking client who stepped out in gleaming leather shoes. No one looked at Ethan. No one recognized the man who had just been fired from the company as the same one who had kept its $100 million payment system from collapsing for 2 straight nights. He walked slowly toward the employee parking lot behind the building. His old Subaru Outback was parked in the furthest corner, near a rain-slicked metal fence. One of the taillights had been cracked since last winter, but Ethan still hadn't had time to fix it. He opened the car door and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine right away. His hands rested on the steering wheel for a long time. His mind was still foggy from lack of sleep. It felt as if his entire body was operating a few seconds behind schedule. His phone buzzed softly on the passenger seat. The screen showed a notification from West Maple Elementary. Parent pickup reminder, 3:15 p.m. Ethan stared at the words for a few seconds, then closed his eyes. In that brief moment, getting fired wasn't even his biggest worry. He just thought about having to be on time today. Lily had had to wait for him twice last month because of system emergencies at SterlingGate. She never blamed him. That only made him feel worse. The old car started on the second try. Ethan drove through the rain-soaked streets of Portland in the pale gray morning light. The city looked as tired as he felt. Coffee shops were starting to fill up. People hurried across intersections, clutching hot lats. A streetcar rumbled across the Burnside Bridge, sending a faint vibration through the cold air. Ethan's apartment was on the east side of the city, in an old building from the early 90s. No elevator, no fancy lobby. Just a narrow hallway that smelled of floor cleaner and the muffled sound of TVs from neighboring units. He opened his apartment door at nearly 9 in the morning and stood for a few seconds in the silent darkness inside. On the old sofa was the blanket Lily had forgotten to fold the morning before. A pair of kid sneakers lay right by the door. The refrigerator was covered in sticky notes and crayon drawings. There was a slightly lopsided drawing from Lily last week. It showed Ethan standing in the rain, holding her hand in front of a huge glass building. Above it, in scrawled writing, were the words, "Dad always comes back." Ethan stared at the piece of paper longer than usual. Then he turned away. He took off his jacket, set his laptop on the kitchen counter, and splashed cold water on his face. In the mirror, he looked much older than 38. The circles under his eyes were dark. Stubble dotted his chin. His dress shirt was so wrinkled it was almost beyond saving. Victoria Harlan had seen all of it this morning and concluded he was the picture of weakness. The funny thing was, SterlingGate had once depended on Ethan more than anyone else in that building. 7 years ago, when the company wasn't yet big enough to rent an entire floor of the Ellison Tower, SterlingGate had nearly gone bankrupt because of a transnational security breach. The transaction authentication system was locked for almost 6 hours. VIP clients threatened to pull their entire accounts. The board was in a state of near panic. Ethan was the one who had locked himself in the server room for days, rewriting a part of the authentication core almost from scratch. No press conference, no big bonus, no moving speech. After that, the company exploded into a Fintech empire serving the ultra-rich. Investor meetings were held in 5-star hotels in Manhattan. The executive team flew first class to Zurich to sign deals with private equity funds. Ferraris and Bentleys started appearing in the lobby of the Ellison Tower every morning. And Ethan was still the last one to turn off the lights on the 31st floor every night. No one ever asked why. Around 3 in the afternoon, Ethan drove to West Maple, a few minutes earlier than usual. The rain had lightened, but the pavement still shimmered with a silvery gray sheen. Lily walked out of the school gate, wearing a yellow jacket that was a little too big for her backpack nearly slipping off her shoulder. The moment she saw her dad's old Subaru, she ran over. "Dad!" Ethan bent down to catch her as Lily threw her arms around him. The faint scent of children's shampoo in her hair made his chest ache in a way that was hard to explain. "Did you wait long?" Lily shook her head. "I knew you would come." Ethan managed a small smile, but it didn't last long. Lily looked up at him, studying his face for a few seconds before asking matter-of-factly, "You didn't sleep, did you?" "I did." "You're a bad liar." Ethan let out a hoarse laugh. It was probably the first time he genuinely laughed all day. On the way home, Lily chattered about a science test and a stray cat behind the school's soccer field. Ethan listened, but his mind was still stuck on the 31st floor of SterlingGate. The red warning alert from the morning replayed in his head like a tiny, persistent bell. "Dad? Did something happen today?" "Nothing." Lily was quiet for a few seconds, then looked out at the rain-streaked car window. "You're being a bad liar again." The evening in the small apartment passed slowly and quietly. Ethan made tacos in the kitchen while Lily sat at the dining table, working on her math homework. The warm yellow kitchen light reflected off her slightly messy brown hair. The soft sizzle of oil, the scratch of a pencil on paper, the low hum of the old heater behind the wall. Sounds so ordinary they were almost invisible. But after his wife passed away, Ethan understood that it was the only thing that kept a small apartment a home. "Dad? Dad, did you lose your job?" The knife in Ethan's hand stopped midair. He didn't turn around right away. "What makes you think that?" "Because you came home today while it was still light out." Ethan let out a slow breath and set the knife down on the kitchen counter. "Yeah." Lily looked up from her math workbook. "Did you do something wrong?" Sometimes a child's question is so simple it cuts deeper than anything else. Ethan leaned against the kitchen counter for a few seconds before he answered. "Losing your job doesn't always mean you did something wrong." Lily thought about that very seriously, then asked again, "Then why did they fire you?" Ethan remembered the ice in Victoria Harlan's eyes that morning. The way she'd looked at his wrinkled shirt, the way the entire room went silent as his access was revoked, as if everyone was afraid they'd be next. "Maybe," he said quietly, "because I look like someone who's failing." Lily immediately shook her head. You're not a failure. Ethan managed a small smile. You're biased. No. Lily looked back down at her math problem, her voice very quiet. I know you always fix things. That sentence left Ethan silent for a long time, because Lily was right. It's what he'd been doing for most of his life. Fixing servers, fixing bugged systems, fixing the leaky pipe in their apartment, fixing the car, fixing the long nights when Lily had a high fever after her mom passed away. There were times Ethan felt like he was spending his entire life just keeping everything around him from collapsing. Around 11 o'clock at night, Lily fell asleep on the sofa with a book lying open on her chest. Ethan gently carried her to her room and pulled the blanket up to her shoulders. He stood beside her bed for a few seconds in the quiet dark. His biggest fear had never been losing his job. It was the fear that one day he wouldn't have the strength to keep going. Ethan went back to the living room and opened his old laptop on the kitchen table. Out of reflex, he logged into a secondary monitoring dashboard he still kept on his personal machine. A system load chart appeared after an unusually long delay. Then another one. Then a series of data sync warnings began to flash orange. Ethan sat up straight. A metric that should have been rock solid was starting to drift from its safe baseline. Slowly, but enough for him to understand what was happening. After his access to the central system had been locked, the Western authentication cluster had started to drift out of sync, and SterlingGate didn't seem to realize their entire financial empire was beginning to slide off the edge of a cliff. The 44th floor of the Ellison Tower was almost completely separate from the rest of SterlingGate. The carpets were thick enough to swallow the sound of footsteps. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls reflected the cold gray Portland sky outside. A black piano sat beside the lounge area, a piece of set dressing for million-dollar meetings that no one ever actually played. Victoria Harlan stood by the executive conference room's glass wall, an untouched espresso in her hand. From that vantage point, she could see nearly the entire downtown area. The small, rain-slicked streets below looked like circuits running through Portland. She liked that feeling. Control from above. An assistant walked past, carrying a binder for next week's investor board meeting in New York. On the table was a presentation outlining SterlingGate's expansion strategy into the international private banking market. The slides were filled with enormous numbers, green growth charts, and photos of wealthy clients stepping off private jets. That was the future Victoria wanted to build. America's most elite fintech empire. No more images of exhausted engineers sleeping in the operations center. No more patch it and pray culture. No more of the old mess. At least, that's what she thought. Victoria? Mason Reed pulled out a chair and sat down at the opposite side of the long, dark walnut conference table. He was in his 50s, with perfectly trimmed salt and pepper hair, and a reassuring calm that always put people at ease. It was one of the reasons Mason had outlasted nearly everyone at SterlingGate. He had a gift for making a crisis sound like a minor inconvenience. "We need to talk about this morning," Victoria said. Mason gave a slight nod as if he'd been expecting it. "Ethan Cole." Victoria set her espresso cup down on the table. "I want to understand why a senior engineer was sleeping in the operations center." Mason let out a faint sigh, the kind a manager gives after dealing with a difficult employee for far too long. "Ethan is good," he said. "No one denies that. But he is incredibly difficult to manage." Victoria listened in silence. "He doesn't like the new protocols. He doesn't like reporting. He doesn't coordinate well with the operations team. And frankly," Mason paused for a few seconds before continuing, "he doesn't fit the new culture you're building. The new culture." Victoria liked the way that phrase hung in the air of the conference room. SterlingGate had grown too fast over the years. The company had once been a small startup of a few engineers crammed into a rented basement in Seattle. But now they managed the payment systems for clients whose account maintenance fees alone could buy a middle-class home every year. Private equity funds, high net worth banking clients, corporations moving tens of millions of dollars an hour through the SterlingGate system. Victoria wanted everything to reflect that prestige, from the way employees dressed, to how they spoke to clients, to how the operations center appeared to investors. And this morning, she had seen a man slumped asleep in a wrinkled shirt in front of 27 warning monitors. In Victoria's mind, that was unacceptable. Mason continued, his voice perfectly calm. "Ethan is an old-school engineer. The kind who thinks being technically brilliant is enough. But SterlingGate is no longer just a tech company. He opened his tablet and slid a data chart across the table toward Victoria. Next quarter, we're signing with 3 new international investment funds. They want stability, professionalism, a world-class image. Victoria nodded slowly. That was exactly what the board had hired her to turn SterlingGate into a luxury financial brand, a name the super-rich would feel safe with while moving millions of dollars through their systems. Outside the glass walls, a helicopter flew past against the misty Portland sky. Mason watched Victoria for a few seconds before he spoke again. "Trust me, firing Ethan is the right decision." Victoria didn't answer right away. She looked down at the growth charts in front of her, then asked, "Is the current system stable?" The question made Mason fall silent for half a second too long. Then he smiled, completely. He was a very smooth liar, because the truth would destroy everything Mason had spent years building. SterlingGate had grown faster than its infrastructure could handle. Investors wanted handsome quarterly returns, so major upgrade plans were constantly postponed. Instead of the entire legacy platform, Mason chose the cheaper solution: patch things here, delay things there, and push everything to the next quarter. And Ethan was the one who had been quietly keeping that entire patchwork system from falling apart. For years, almost every critical error passed through Ethan's hands before it ever reached the executive conference table on the 44th floor. There were nights the transaction authentication cluster nearly went down at 2 a.m., and Ethan would have it fixed before the first clients in New York even woke up. There were weekends he'd sit alone in the operations center for 16 hours straight just to patch a critical memory leak that SterlingGate should have addressed 3 years prior. No major incident reports, no media crises, no one knew. Mason liked it that way because a system that didn't create scandals kept the quarterly reports looking clean. And as long as the shareholders saw steady profit growth, no one asked how rotten the infrastructure underneath it all had become. Claire Donovan knew. She was in the 31st floor operations center now, watching small warnings flash across the monitors, only to disappear moments later. The coffee in her mug had gone cold. Claire pulled her cardigan tighter as the central air blasted through the frigid room. A junior engineer nearby was typing faster than usual. "Are you seeing the latency spike?" he asked quietly. Claire looked at the chart. Yes, it was small, but it was there. She thought of the countless times Ethan had spotted signs like this long before anyone else did. He never raised an alarm. He just quietly fixed it. That's what made Ethan different. He didn't want to send the company into a panic. Didn't want to drag everyone into emergency meetings at 3 in the morning. Didn't want SterlingGate to lose clients over an error he believed he could handle himself. For years, Ethan had been the buffer between a decaying system and the executives on the 44th floor. Claire had asked him once why he didn't just quit. That night, he'd been sitting alone in the operations center, close to 1 a.m. He just gave a small smile and said, "If I leave, this whole place will blow up one day." At the time, Claire had thought he was exaggerating. Now she wasn't so sure. The sudden ring of an internal phone on a desk made a few people in the room jump. Claire picked it up. The voice of an operator from the West Coast team came through, more rushed than usual. "We're seeing a transaction routing delay." Claire sat up straight. "How bad is it?" "Not major, but it's escalating quickly." Claire glanced up at the main dashboard. A line on one of the graphs had started to drift out of the safe zone. Just barely, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. Meanwhile, up on the 44th floor, Victoria was watching a presentation: strategies for attracting luxury clients from Dubai and London. Polished slides cycled across the large screen in the center of the conference room. Private wealth expansion, premium international accounts, ultra-high net worth acquisition. No one in that room knew that at this very moment, a section of SterlingGate's Western system had just begun to misroute a batch of corporate transactions worth $18.7 million. The rain began to fall harder after midnight. Drops pattered against the glass of Ethan's small apartment, streaking down toward the dark street below. Portland at night had a particular kind of cold and lonely feel. It wasn't loud, not violent. It was as if the entire city were trying to pull itself inward into the darkness and the sound of the rain. In the small kitchen, a pot of pasta water was still steaming lightly on the stove. Ethan stood leaning against the counter, his eyes on the phone lying face down next to his laptop. The screen kept lighting up, then going dark. A new message, another one, and then another. Ethan didn't open them. He knew what they said before he even read them. Lily was on the sofa with a thin blanket wrapped around her legs, coloring and glancing over at her father from time to time. Since he'd come home, Ethan had hardly let his phone out of his sight for more than a few minutes. He was trying to act normal, but kids pick up on the little things much faster than adults realize. The phone vibrated again. This time, Ethan looked down. Marcus Levy, Network OPS. You seeing the logs? The second message arrived almost immediately. The system's slipping. Ethan pinched the bridge of his nose, then set the phone down again. He didn't work at SterlingGate anymore. At least, not officially. His access had been revoked. Employee badge cut in half. His internal accounts were probably completely disabled by now. A part of him understood that whatever happened next was no longer his responsibility. But the problem was, Ethan knew exactly how the system was dying. And that was the thing that wouldn't let him rest. He went back to the kitchen and turned off the heat under the pasta. The smell of warm tomato sauce and garlic drifted through the small apartment. Normally, Lily would be telling him stories about school during dinner. But tonight, she was quieter than usual. Dad, yeah, are you worried? Ethan took 2 plates down from the cabinet. Not really. You're a bad liar. Ethan let out a soft laugh through his nose, but didn't deny it. The two of them sat down to eat at the small wooden table by the window. The sound of the rain and the old heater blended into a steady, sleepy hum. Lily twirled the pasta around her fork carefully, as if she were thinking about something serious. Ethan's phone lit up again. Claire, Donovan. He stared at the screen for a few seconds before opening it. Ethan, we're seeing a rapid increase in routing delay. Another message appeared. No one understands your Western patch. Then one more. Mason says to just reboot the backup cluster. Ethan's head shot up from the phone. A cold feeling ran down his spine. No, they can't reboot that cluster. At least, not now. He almost reached for the phone instantly, then stopped himself midway, because just then the image of that morning flashed through his mind. Victoria Harlan stood in the middle of the command center, her eyes like ice. The way the entire room fell silent when they fired him. The way Mason refused to meet his eyes as he revoked his access. Ethan set his phone down on the table. He owed SterlingGate nothing. No one on the 44th floor had ever asked how long he'd been awake. No one asked why he was always the last person to leave the command center. No one cared about the nights he slept on the couch because the system was too unstable to leave alone. Lily looked up at her dad. What's wrong? Ethan was quiet for a few seconds, then said, Dad's old company is having some trouble. Is it big? Could be. Lily rested her chin on her hands, studying him for a long time in that way only a child can. Without judgment. Just watching. Are you going to help them? Ethan didn't answer right away. Outside the window, the headlights of a car swept across the rain-slicked street below before disappearing into the night. The phone buzzed again. Marcus. We've lost sync on the Arizona cluster. Claire, Mason wants to do a full reboot. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. He knew if they rebooted now, the authentication system would fall completely out of step with the backlog transaction queue. And when that happened, SterlingGate wouldn't just be slow anymore. It would start to tear itself apart. Lily kept watching her father. If people are mean to you, she asked, her voice soft, do you still help them? The question made Ethan sit perfectly still for a long time. The apartment grew so quiet, he could hear the rain tracing lines down the window pane. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and looked down at his own hands. His fingers were still trembling slightly from a lack of sleep. I'm not helping them because they were kind, he said slowly. I'm helping because if that system goes down, a lot of innocent people are going to get hurt. Lily glanced down at her plate of pasta for a few seconds. Is that fair? Ethan let out a soft, tired laugh. The right thing isn't always fair. She didn't say anything else, but Ethan knew she was trying to understand it in the way an 8-year-old does. The phone kept vibrating, a constant hum against the table. Every time the screen lit up, it was a new alert. Another routing queue falling out of sync. A processing node timing out. An enterprise payment cluster starting to desynchronize. SterlingGate was slipping away faster than he'd thought. Ethan got up, took his plate to the sink and came back to open his laptop. The screen's light reflected on his tired face. The system load charts weren't just orange anymore. A few clusters had turned red. He looked at the transaction flow for a few seconds and immediately understood what was happening. Mason had ordered the load to be shifted to the West backup cluster, a fatal mistake. Ethan pulled his chair in, his movements quick. His fingers moved over the keyboard, an almost instinctual reflex. But then familiar words appeared on the screen. Access dented. His account had been completely locked. Ethan swore softly under his breath. Lily looked up from her coloring book. Dad? It's nothing. But things were clearly not okay. A moment later, Ethan picked up his phone again. His thumb hovered over the screen for a long moment before opening his chat with Claire Donovan. He typed just one line. Don't reboot the West backup cluster. Ethan hit send immediately. The message showed a delivered status. He stared at his phone screen for a few seconds. Then the phone vibrated almost instantly. Claire replied with just one short sentence. Too late, the SterlingGate crisis didn't start with blaring sirens or a spectacular system crash like in the movies. It began with things so small, most people in the company didn't even notice them. At first, a corporate transaction taking an extra 12 seconds to validate. A premium account in Manhattan having to reload the app twice just to log in. An international wire transfer from London to Singapore stuck in the queue for 3 minutes longer than usual. Things like that. Very small, very easy to ignore. But for those who understood how the SterlingGate system worked, they were the kind of signs that made your stomach go cold. 11:47 p.m. In the 31st floor operations center, almost no one was speaking above a whisper. The sound of keyboards grew more frantic in the cold air of the room. The massive screens covering the north wall no longer dotted with sporadic yellow flashes like they had been that morning. Red alert boxes began to appear, one, then another. Claire Donovan stood by the central command console, a cold cup of coffee in her hand. She couldn't remember when she'd taken the last sip. Her eyes were glued to the transaction flowchart, which was fluctuating more and more erratically. Queue delay is up another 20%, Marcus said from across the room. Another engineer immediately called out, Phoenix cluster just lost sync again. Backup auth node is timing out. We've lost response from the Denver cluster. The reports started to overlap, coming faster. No one was sitting completely still anymore. A young engineer shot up from his chair and ran to a neighboring bank of monitors. The sound of the chair's wheels scraping across the floor was jarring in a room stretched as taut as a wire. Claire glanced up at the wall clock, 11:52 p. It had been less than 16 hours since Ethan was fired. She opened her old chat window with him again. No new messages. Claire remembered the last thing Ethan had sent. Don't restart the Western backup cluster. But Mason had ordered a full cluster reboot nearly an hour ago, and immediately after, everything began to spin out of orbit. On the 44th floor, Victoria Harlan was still trying to maintain the perfect composure of a CEO in front of her executive board. But that control was beginning to show its first cracks. The large screen in the executive conference room flashed with continuous system warnings. Urgent emails from the premium client services team began pouring in. Private client, it's you, high priority. Urgent account access failure. Wire delay complaint. Victoria stood by the conference table, arms crossed over her chest. Her cream-colored suit was as perfect as it had been that morning. But her eyes were different, sharper, quicker, no longer completely certain. What the hell is happening down there? She asked. Mason Reed stood on the opposite side of the table, his voice maintaining its familiar calm. It's just a ripple effect from rebooting the Western cluster. We're handling it. You said the system was stable. It is stable. Just as Mason said that, an assistant hurried into the room, her face pale. Mom, we just received a call from Hallberg Private Capital. Victoria turned immediately. What is it? Their clients have temporarily lost access to their reserve accounts. How much? The assistant swallowed hard, $42 million. The entire conference room went silent for a few seconds. Outside, the rain tapped softly against the floor-to-ceiling glass. Victoria slowly turned to look at Mason. For the first time all night, he didn't answer right away. On the 31st floor, the air was now so cold, Claire could feel her fingertips go numb. The red glow of the monitors reflected off the tired faces of the engineers, making the whole room look like a hospital handling a mass casualty event. A new system alert flashed onto the central screen. Offie swore Fulcher risk. Mark swore under his breath. We need Ethan, no one argued. That was the most frightening part. For years at SterlingGate, Ethan had been nearly invisible. He always sat in the back corner of the operations center with his cold coffee and wrinkled shirts. No one talked about him in executive meetings. No one mentioned his name at fundraising parties in five-star hotels. The investors, stepping out of supercars in the lobby of the Ellison Tower, never even knew the man existed. But now, as the system began to crumble piece by piece, the void Ethan left behind had become painfully obvious. Claire opened the system log again. The manual patches Ethan wrote were still scattered all over the transaction routing system. No complete documentation, no detailed explanations, just short, cryptic notes like, temporary fix, don't restart during live queue, or memory bleed isolated manually. Claire remembered asking him once why he didn't document everything properly. He had just given her a tired smile and said, "'Cause I always thought I'd fix it the right way over the weekend." But that weekend never came. SterlingGate grew too fast. Too many major clients. Too many million-dollar transactions. Too much pressure to keep the shareholder report looking pristine. And so, Ethan just kept patching one section at a time, like a man trying to hold a cracking dam together with his bare hands. The internal phone on Claire's desk rang again. "Claire, we just lost 2 more secondary routing clusters. Premium clients in Chicago can't get into the system. London escalation is calling nonstop. Transaction reconciliation is starting to drift." Claire closed her eyes for a few seconds. She knew this was only going to get worse. Up on the 44th floor, Victoria had finally stopped pretending this was a minor glitch. "How long to fix it?" Mason took a slow breath. "We need more time." "How long?" "Could be a few hours." "A few hours?" Victoria almost let out a laugh of disbelief. "Do you have any idea how much money each hour of downtime is burning?" Mason was silent. Then he said the first sentence that changed the entire room. "It's possible Ethan left behind some malicious code." The air seemed to turn to ice. Victoria stared at him for several seconds. Malicious code? He was the only person who completely understood the Western patches, and the timing of this, Mason gave a very slight shrug. "It's suspicious." Victoria didn't answer right away, but she wanted to believe it, because if Mason was right, then this wasn't her fault. It wasn't the consequence of the hasty firing decision she'd made that morning. It wasn't because she had just pushed the only person who understood the system out of the building. It was Ethan's fault. That thought was a much easier one to bear. On the 31st floor, Claire heard that conversation over the open internal line. She could hardly believe it. Malicious code? Marcus shot up from his chair. Ethan would never do that. Claire said nothing, but she knew Marcus was right. Ethan was the kind of man who would stay at the office for 46 hours straight just to keep a client from feeling the impact. He'd once slept on a couch in the operations center because he refused to leave the system alone while a memory leak was still unstable. Someone like Ethan could be exhausted. He could be quiet. He could be difficult to get close to. But he wasn't the type to sabotage something. Claire turned back to the internal security camera monitor, then paused. A thought had just surfaced. She quickly pulled up the camera data from 2 nights ago. The footage began to play. 1:13 a.m. The operations center was almost completely empty. Ethan sat alone amidst rows of blinking monitors, his hands moving constantly between the keyboard and a secondary control panel. A cold cup of coffee sat beside him. He was still wearing the same shirt Victoria had seen him in that morning. The camera fast-forwarded, 3:42 a.m. Ethan was still there, 5:16 a.m. Still there, 7:03 a.m. He was standing by the West server cluster, his laptop open in his hands. Claire continued to scrub through the footage. Then she stopped on a different frame. At that exact same time, the main lobby camera had recorded Mason Reed getting into a black Mercedes with 2 other investors. The timestamp was clear, 9:48 p.m. The destination listed on the executive schedule, Vesper and Gold, the most luxurious rooftop restaurant in downtown Portland, the place where SterlingGate's senior management often dined with investors and VIP clients. Claire stared at the camera monitor for a long time. While Ethan had stayed behind, patching the system alone for 2 straight nights, Mason had been drinking with investors at a high-end restaurant overlooking the city. 2:14 in the morning. The Ellison Tower was still lit, a giant, sleepless vessel in the heart of Portland. From the outside, SterlingGate still looked perfect. Its blue-tinted glass reflected the city lights. The company logo still glowed above the boulevard, as if the financial empire within was completely stable. But up on the 31st floor, no one was pretending anymore. Red alerts had almost completely covered the central dashboard, the frantic sound of keyboards, the incessant ringing of internal phone lines. A young engineer had just run into the room, his face pale from lack of sleep. "We've lost another queue in the east routing." Marcus looked up from his screen. "How many transactions?" "Over 6,000 pending." Claire Donovan stood in the middle of the sterile, cold room, her arms crossed over her chest. She could barely feel her fingertips anymore. Cold coffee cups littered the control desks. No one had really eaten anything for hours. SterlingGate was starting to bleed from the inside, and Mason Reed understood that better than anyone. He stood in his private office on the 44th floor, the door shut, the light from his laptop screen, reflecting on a face that was taut with a tension he hadn't shown in years. His tie was loosened from his collar. The internal downtime report open on the screen in front of him looked like a verdict being written, line by line. If the truth came out, Mason would lose everything. It wasn't just the job. It was 20 years of his reputation in Fintech. The entire SterlingGate system should have been upgraded nearly 3 years ago. Ethan had warned them multiple times about the memory bleed in the Western authentication cluster and the transaction routing cascade. But Mason always pushed it off. Too expensive, too risky for the quarterly reports, too dangerous for the growth narrative the board of directors wanted to see. Instead of replacing the foundation, he had Ethan patch the cracks. And Ethan did, again and again. Mason opened the system logs again, then pulled a command line window up beside it. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a few seconds before he began editing the metadata of an old patch string. Timestamp changed. User attribution changed. A few authorization lines subtly altered. It was almost impossible to spot if you didn't know exactly where to look. Mason wasn't as good an engineer as Ethan, but he was good enough to make an exhausted man look like the perfect suspect. The internal phone buzzed. "Victoria Harlan." Mason answered immediately. "We need an answer before the board calls back at 6 a.m. Victoria said, her voice colder and faster than usual. "Private banking clients are threatening to pull their accounts." Mason looked at the doctored log on his screen. "I think Ethan left behind some faulty code." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure?" He was the only one who understood the entire Western cluster, and the failure started right after his access was revoked. Victoria didn't reply right away, because a part of her wanted to believe it. If Mason was right, then the decision to fire Ethan wasn't a mistake. If Mason was right, then she hadn't been too hasty. If Mason was right, then SterlingGate was the victim of a disgruntled engineer. That thought was so much easier to accept than the possibility she had just pushed the only person keeping the system alive out of the building. "We need to get legal involved," Victoria said finally. Mason let out a quiet breath. She was on board. "Freeze Ethan's severance," he continued, his voice perfectly calm. "And if we have to, we should notify the financial authorities that we suspect internal sabotage." Victoria walked to the glass wall of her executive office. The city of Portland below was still soaked in a cold night rain. "Do it." In a small apartment on the east side of the city, Ethan was still awake. His laptop was open on the kitchen table. Red charts reflected on his tired face in the dim pre-dawn light. Lily was asleep in the next room. Through the wall, the old heater hummed in a steady rhythm. Ethan's phone vibrated. A SterlingGate internal number. He stared at the screen for a few seconds before answering. "Mr. Cole?" An executive assistant's voice came through. "CEO Harlan needs to see you at the Ellison Tower immediately." Ethan glanced at the clock. 2:41 a.m. "What for?" "The legal department needs to speak with you about the system incidents." Ethan almost let out a quiet laugh, born of pure exhaustion. It wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was the sound of a man who'd just heard something painfully familiar. "All right," he said softly. "I'll be there." He hung up the phone and sat in silence for a few seconds. Part of him knew it was a trap. The other part needed to know just how bad things at SterlingGate had become. Ethan stood, pulled on his jacket, and went to check on Lily. She was still asleep on her side, clutching an old teddy bear to her chest. Lily's allergy medication was on the nightstand. He picked it up instinctively and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He had to pick up her refill in the morning, no matter how much the world outside was falling apart. The rain was still falling when Ethan arrived back at the Ellison Tower. around 3 in the morning. The main lobby was nearly deserted. Just the night security guard and a few executives hurrying past, their faces pale. A financial ticker behind the reception desk was displaying news of system-wide trading disruptions at SterlingGate Financial. The news was starting to leak out. The guard looked at Ethan differently than he had that morning. It wasn't the look for a fired employee anymore. It was the look for someone being dragged back to the scene of an accident. The elevator opened on the 44th floor with a soft ding. The glass-walled executive conference room was still lit. Victoria Harlan stood beside the long walnut table, flanked by 2 in-house lawyers. Her suit was still perfect, but her eyes no longer held the steady composure from the day before. Ethan walked in, no suit jacket, no tie. Just an old dark coat, shoulders still damp with rain, and the small box of Lily's allergy medicine clutched in his hand. The contrast between Ethan and the room was stark. On one side, glass, steel, expensive watches, and corporate lawyers. On the other, an exhausted man who hadn't slept properly in nearly 3 days. Victoria pulled out a chair and sat down, very slowly. "Mr. Cole." Ethan didn't sit. He just stared past her at the screens visible through the glass, where red data bled across the displays. Worse than he'd thought. Much worse. Victoria placed both hands flat on the table. "Do you have any idea how much damage you've caused?" The question landed in the cold, silent room. One of the lawyers had a file open in front of him, as if preparing for a formal deposition. Ethan remained quiet for a few moments. He looked at Victoria for a long time. Not with anger, not with defensiveness, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from trying to hold everything together by yourself for far too long. Then very quietly he spoke. "No." Victoria frowned. Ethan continued. "You still don't understand who caused this." The air in the room was almost completely still. A lawyer shifted slightly in his chair. Victoria kept her eyes locked on Ethan, but her hand tightened on the glass tabletop. Just then, the conference room door opened. Claire Donovan walked in, tablet in hand. She spoke quickly to Victoria about a transaction queue that had just collapsed in the Chicago cluster, then placed the tablet on the table. As she walked past Ethan, Claire barely glanced at him. But in that fleeting moment, she secretly slipped a small black USB drive into the pocket of his jacket. No one else in the room noticed, except Ethan. Ethan left the Ellison Tower at nearly 4 in the morning. The rain had lightened, but a cold wind still whipped through the nearly empty streets of downtown Portland. In that moment, the city felt like a stage after the performance was over. The lights were still on. The glass towers still stood, but inside, things had begun to fracture. The small USB drive Claire had slipped into his jacket pocket was still in Ethan's hand as he sat in his car in the lot behind the building. He didn't plug it in yet. His mind was too tired to think clearly. The past 2 days had blurred together into a single sequence of screen glare, the hum of server fans, and cold conversations in glass-walled meeting rooms. His phone vibrated again, a new email from SterlingGate's legal department. Noter of investigation. Ethan opened it, reading in the pale blue light of the phone's screen. The dry, corporate legal tone was almost completely devoid of human emotion. SterlingGate Financial is conducting an internal investigation regarding conduct potentially detrimental to the financial infrastructure systems. Obligation to cooperate may refer the matter to federal authorities. Ethan read that far and then locked his phone. He wasn't angry. That was the saddest part. If this had been 10 years ago, he probably would have slammed his fist on the steering wheel or gone back up to the 44th floor and screamed at all of them. But now he just felt tired. The kind of tired that made emotions feel too heavy to carry. Ethan leaned his head back against the driver's seat and closed his eyes for a few seconds. Outside the car window, rainwater streaked across the blurry yellow lights of the parking lot. He thought of Lily, thought about how in a few hours she would wake up and get ready for school just like any other day. Meanwhile, out here, SterlingGate was preparing to make him the perfect scapegoat. An exhausted engineer, a terminated employee, a lone man who understood the system better than anyone else. It was a narrative that sounded all too plausible to the press. The phone vibrated again, a text from Marcus this time. CNN Business just posted a story. Ethan opened the link. The headline materialized almost instantly in the middle of the screen. Former SterlingGate engineer under review after system failure. He scrolled down. An internal source stated the engineer had previous disputes with the executive board before his termination. Allegations of unauthorized changes to transaction routing. SterlingGate has declined to comment on the specifics. Ethan read a few more lines, then stopped. Mason moved faster than he thought, not to save the system, but to save himself. It was nearly dawn when Ethan got back to the apartment. Portland was beginning to lighten behind a veil of cold gray clouds. A few delivery trucks passed on the street below, their tires kicking up rainwater from the pavement. He opened the apartment door as quietly as he could, trying not to wake Lily. But she was already awake. Lily was sitting on the sofa, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, the TV on at a low volume. The pale blue light from the screen reflected on her sleepy face. Ethan immediately grabbed the remote and turned off the TV. Too late. Lily had already seen the text crawling across the bottom of the news report. Engineer linked to financial system disruption. The apartment was silent for a few seconds. Dad? Ethan stood frozen by the door. Yeah? Lily looked at him for a long time, the way a child does when trying to understand something far too big for them. Are you a bad person? The question felt like it knocked all the air from Ethan's chest, not from anger, but from pain. A very quiet kind of pain. He walked over and knelt in front of her, pulling the blanket up around her again. His hands were still cold from the night rain. No, but the TV said. The TV doesn't know everything. Lily looked down at the edge of the blanket for a few seconds. A girl at school said her friend's dad was taken by the police for doing something bad. Ethan closed his eyes just for a moment. He understood how fast this was going to spread. SterlingGate was too big. A multi-hundred-million-dollar payment system in crisis was blood in the water for the financial press. And Mason had given them a name to blame, Ethan. Lily looked up again. Are you going to be arrested? That question made him pause. Not because he was afraid of the police, but because for the first time, he realized this could follow Lily for years to come. The kids at school would remember. Google would remember. The internet always remembers. If he stayed silent, Lily would grow up with the story that her father was the man who destroyed a financial empire. And SterlingGate would let that happen, as long as it saved their stock price. Ethan rested his elbows on his knees, his head bowed for a few long seconds. Lily had never seen her dad like this, not angry, not panicked, just tired. She scooted closer on the sofa and rested her head on his shoulder. I know you're not bad, Dad, Lily whispered. Those words nearly broke something inside him. Because he realized Lily was having to comfort him, an 8-year-old shouldn't have to do that. Outside the glass door, the sky was beginning to lighten. Thin streaks of rain ran across the early Portland light. The old heater hummed steadily from behind the small apartment's wall. Ethan stared into the space ahead of him for a long time. He thought of Claire, of Marcus, of the engineers fighting to keep the system alive, of Victoria Harlan, clinging to the narrative that he was the culprit, because the truth was so much more dangerous. And then he thought of the USB drive in his jacket pocket. Claire hadn't given it to him just so he could protect himself. She was trying to tell him something. Ethan stood up slowly, walked to the kitchen table, and opened his laptop. Lily sat still on the sofa watching him. The USB drive made a soft click as he slid it into the port. A folder opened, system logs, security footage, internal routing reports, and one short audio file. Ethan clicked on it. Mason's voice came through the faint hiss of a conference room recording. Just keep everything stable until the end of the quarter. I don't care what kind of patches Ethan has to use. Ethan stopped the file. He sat motionless before the screen for a long time. He finally understood what Claire was doing. She wasn't just giving him proof, she was giving him a choice, to stay silent or to drag the whole truth into the light. Lily came and stood beside her dad. Dad? Ethan turned to look at her. What are you going to do? He glanced at the laptop screen again. The glowing red system logs continued to flash, like a wound growing wider by the minute. SterlingGate was still collapsing, and Mason was still trying to bury everyone with it. Ethan let out a slow breath. I'm going to fix this. How? He was quiet for a few seconds, with the truth. Sometime around 6 a.m., Ethan stepped out onto the apartment's small balcony, phone in hand. The rain had all but stopped. The city of Portland was steeped in the cold, gray light of dawn. The last of the downtown lights still glowed. Ethan opened his contacts, his thumb hovering over one name for a long time. Robert Hale, former federal financial security inspector. 7 years ago, when SterlingGate nearly collapsed from an international security breach, Robert was the only person outside the company who had seen Ethan work for nearly a week straight, without sleep just to keep the system alive. Robert had once said something to him that Ethan never forgot. "You have no idea how much you're holding together." Ethan stared at the name for a few more seconds. Then he hit call. The Marlowe Grand Hotel stood in the middle of downtown Portland, like a different version of the outside world. The main lobby was paved with cream-colored marble. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, casting a soft golden glow on expensive suits and champagne flutes resting on silver trays. A line of Bentleys, Mercedes Maybachs, and Rolls-Royces idled at the hotel's entrance against the backdrop of a light afternoon drizzle. SterlingGate had never held an emergency meeting here before. But Victoria Harlan understood one thing perfectly. When the market began to panic, appearances were the last thing she could still control. And today, those appearances had to be perfect. The conference room on the hotel's top floor was packed. The board of directors, corporate lawyers, private banking representatives, international investors. Some of SterlingGate's biggest VIP clients were also present. Now that the payment system had been sending tremors through the entire financial industry for nearly 2 days. The air in the luxurious room smelled of expensive perfume, hot coffee, and the fear of losing money. A massive LED screen at the front of the room displayed a chart of the transaction disruption, a sea of red that stretched on like a wound that wouldn't clot. Victoria stood by the conference table, her expression as controlled as ever, but underneath that calm facade was a weariness she could no longer fully conceal. She'd barely slept since the morning Ethan had been fired. The worst part was that a piece of her was starting to have doubts, not about the system, but about herself. "We need to have a clear answer before the markets open tomorrow morning," a board member said. "Otherwise, the hedge funds are going to start pulling out." Victoria gave a slight nod, then turned to Mason. "Begin." Mason rose slowly. His dark blue suit was perfect, down to the last crease. His voice was as calm as ever. It was the kind of calm that made people trust him even when he was lying. The screen behind him changed to a new slide. Trinkle Sakifa Ryu. Mason began his presentation in a steady monotone, like someone reading a quarterly financial report. "Based on our preliminary investigation, we believe the primary cause of the incident stems from unauthorized changes to the transaction routing architecture." A few people in the room exchanged glances. These changes are directly linked to Ethan Cole, the former senior infrastructure engineer who was terminated just before the system began to destabilize. Ethan's name appeared in the center of the massive screen, followed by his old employee headshot. A man with a wrinkled shirt and dark circles under his eyes, projected into a room of $1,000 suits, looked completely and utterly out of place. Victoria stared at the image for a few seconds. The moment from the day before flashed through her mind. Ethan, standing in the middle of the command center, exhausted, his eyes red from lack of sleep. Back then, she'd thought she was eliminating a problem. Now she wasn't so sure. Mason continued. "We are currently cooperating with our legal department and federal authorities too." The conference room door opened, not loudly, but loud enough to make the entire room turn. Ethan Cole walked in, flanked by Claire Donovan and Robert Hale. No suit, no tie, no perfectly polished corporate image. Just an old dark jacket, his hair still damp from the rain, and the tired face of a man who hadn't had a full night's sleep in days. The contrast between Ethan and the room was so stark, it made some of the people there visibly uncomfortable. A few of the investors scowled. An in-house lawyer let out a quiet sigh, as if this was the last thing he wanted to see. But Robert Hale was different. The man standing next to Ethan, somewhere in his 60s with short silver hair, had an unusual presence. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to assert his authority. And yet, almost everyone in federal finance knew exactly who he was. Former federal financial security investigator, a man who almost never showed up unless things were truly serious. For the first time, Mason faltered. Victoria looked at Ethan. And for the first time since this all began, she felt the room was no longer completely under her control. Robert Hale stepped forward. "Before SterlingGate continues to place the blame on a fired employee," he said calmly, "I think everyone here should see something." Mason immediately cut in. "This is an internal meeting." "No," Robert cut him off. "This is a meeting about a multi-billion-dollar financial system that is collapsing." The air in the room changed instantly. Claire connected her laptop to the central display. Mason's slide disappeared. In its place, the original system logs. The first reveal began. Claire brought up the transaction timeline from 48 hours prior. Lines of log data streamed across the large screen, timestamp, memory stabilization patch, manual load balancing, emergency queue rerouting. Robert scanned the room. These are the original unedited logs. Ethan Cole kept the transaction core alive for an additional 46 hours after the West cluster began to memory bleed. Several engineers in the boardroom immediately paled. One of them whispered, "My God." Claire continued, pulling up a system chart. "If Ethan hadn't stayed for those 2 nights," she said, "SterlingGate would have completely collapsed before the Asian markets even opened." Victoria stared at the screen, unblinking. She had never been told any of this. Mason interjected immediately. "There's no way to confirm if those logs are authentic." Claire turned to face him. "Because you altered the other version." The room froze. Mason shot to his feet. "Are you accusing me?" Robert Hale didn't let him continue. "Security footage." Footage appeared on the large screen. 113M Ethan, alone in the operations center. 3:42 a.m. model still there. 5:16 a.m. still there. The light from the rows of monitors reflected off his exhausted face in the nearly empty room. Then the footage cut to the executive lobby camera. 9:48 p.m. Mason Reed stepped into a black Mercedes with 2 other investors. The destination on his calendar was clear. Vesper and gold. A real murmur started to ripple through the room. A board member looked at Mason as if seeing him for the first time. But it didn't stop there. Claire opened the next file, an internal email. A thread stretching back nearly 3 years appeared on the screen. "Ethan Cole, we need to replace the transaction core before Q4. Ethan Cole, the memory leak will cause a cascade failure if we keep delaying. Ethan Cole, manual patching is no longer safe." The reply from Mason Reed, "Not in the budget this quarter. Push it to next year. Just keep the system stable until the shareholder meeting." Victoria felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Everything she had believed for the past 2 days was starting to crumble right in front of her. It wasn't Ethan who hid the truth. The entire executive team hid it from her. An in-house counsel shot to his feet. "We need to stop this meeting right now." "Not yet," Robert Hale said. Claire opened the final file, an audio recording. Mason's voice filled the dead silent conference room. "Change the attribution in the logs." Another voice asked, "You want to pin this on Ethan?" Mason's reply was almost immediate. "We need someone to take the fall before the market opens." No one said another word. There was only the sound of the light rain tapping against the large glass wall at the back of the room. Victoria slowly turned to look at Mason. For the first time since becoming CEO, she truly saw him. Not the trusted executive, not the man who kept the company steady, but a man who used silence and his corporate image to hide a system that was rotting from within. Then, Robert Hale delivered his final line. 7 years ago, SterlingGate was on the verge of collapse from an international financial attack. A few people in the room immediately looked up. They had never heard this story. Ethan Cole was the one who kept the system alive for nearly a solid week. Robert looked directly at the board of directors. "Your company kept the entire incident under wraps because you were afraid it would affect stock prices before a round of funding." Victoria looked at Ethan. He was still standing motionless at the back of the room. No triumph, no pride, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from holding something massive together for far too long, all while nobody was really watching. And that was the moment Victoria understood the worst part. It wasn't just that Ethan was innocent. It was that she had been on the wrong side. On the side of people who looked at an exhausted human being and called it unprofessional. On the side of a system that cared more about quarterly reports, a luxury image, and first-class clients than about the people quietly keeping everything running. Mason finally lost control. He slammed his hand on the table, making the water glasses tremble. "You people have no idea the pressure I was under to keep this company alive." No one answered. Mason pointed a finger straight at Ethan. "An exhausted single father cannot be more important than the entire executive board." The room went silent, completely silent. After Mason Reed's shout, nobody in the conference room of the Marlowe Grand Hotel said a word. The only sound left in the room was the patter of rain against the large glass panes behind the expensive suits and the untouched water glasses. A few of the investors began to avoid his gaze. The man who had always projected perfect corporate calm now stood in the middle of the luxurious room, like someone who had just ripped off his own final mask. Victoria Harlan remained silent at the head of the table, but the look in her eyes had completely changed. For the first time since she joined SterlingGate, she no longer saw Ethan Cole as a problem employee. She saw an exhausted man who had been trying to keep both the system and his own life from collapsing at the same time. And she realized the thing that made it hardest to breathe wasn't that the company was losing millions of dollars an hour. It was the fact that she had played a part in this. A board member was the first to stand. "This meeting is over." His voice was colder and shorter than usual. "The legal department will take it from here." Two in-house lawyers immediately walked towards Mason. No one was protecting him anymore. No one was trying to salvage the image of SterlingGate's veteran executive. The same people who had once shared dinners with him at luxurious rooftop restaurants now seemed afraid to even stand too close. Mason Reed, one of the lawyers, said, "You are hereby suspended, effective immediately, from all executive duties at SterlingGate Financial." Mason let out a quiet laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It was the sound of a man who had just realized he'd finally run out of road. "You think pinning this all on me will fix it?" He scanned the room. "None of you want to know what it really took to keep that system alive." No one answered, because this time, everyone understood the problem was no longer technical. It was greed. The postponed upgrades, all to keep the profit reports looking good. The financial quarters built on artificial growth. The slick executive presentations in five-star hotels, while the 31st floor was practically running on manual patches from one exhausted man. Mason was escorted from the conference room under the silent watch of the entire board. Things moved quickly after that. An internal investigation was opened just hours later. Then came the federal investigation. Fabricated logs were discovered, emails postponing the upgrades were retrieved, audio recordings leaked to the legal department and then to the major shareholders. The tone of the financial press shifted almost overnight. From former engineer under investigation to SterlingGate executives accused of internal cover-up, and then whistleblower evidence reveals years of infrastructure neglect. Mason Reed's name was on every major financial news outlet for nearly a week, falsifying internal logs, concealing systemic risks, manipulating operational reports, scapegoating an employee, causing severe financial damages. But SterlingGate couldn't just sacrifice Mason and consider the matter closed. Victoria Harlan understood that even before the board called her into a closed-door meeting. 19 days. That was the entire length of her time as CEO. So short, it was almost absurd. The meeting took place in the executive suite on the top floor of the Ellison Tower. No more media cameras, no more growth projection slides, no more talk of the future of premium fintech. All that was left were tired people trying to stop the company from bleeding any more trust. Victoria, the chairman of the board, said slowly, "SterlingGate needs to present a decisive change to the market." She knew what that meant immediately. No one had to explain further. Victoria signed the resignation letter in near silence, no arguments, no resistance, because deep down, she knew they weren't entirely wrong. After the meeting, Victoria stood alone for a long time in the executive office, looking down at Portland through the cold gray glass. The city below operated as if nothing had changed. Cars still moved. Traffic lights still changed color. People were still walking into coffee shops for their morning lattes, and she had just lost the position she had spent nearly 10 years working to achieve. But what Victoria couldn't stop thinking about wasn't the CEO title. It was a moment from earlier that morning on the 31st floor. Ethan Cole slumped asleep amidst a bank of warning monitors. The wrinkled shirt, the cold cup of coffee, the eyes red from a lack of sleep, and the only thing she saw in that moment was a lack of professionalism. Not a man who had been awake for nearly 2 days just to keep the system alive. Not a single father who still had to remember what time to pick up his daughter while the transaction core was dying. Not the person who had spent years patching up the entire company's mistakes. She only saw an image that didn't fit the perfect corporate standards she wanted to build. And that brought Victoria a shame that hurt more than losing her position ever could. 3 days later, Ethan was invited back to SterlingGate. This time, it wasn't through a legal email. It was a formal offer from the board of directors, a private office on the executive floor, a salary nearly 3 times higher, full authority over the entire system infrastructure, a company car, stock options. It was a position that just about any engineer in the fintech industry would dream of. Ethan finished reading the offer in his small apartment, then set it down on the kitchen table next to Lily's box of cereal. The atmosphere in the apartment was exactly the same as it was before everything happened. The old heater still hummed faintly in the walls. The soft yellow kitchen light still reflected off the drawings Lily had taped to the refrigerator. SterlingGate had just weathered the biggest crisis in its history. But in here, everything was still completely normal. Lily was at the dining table doing her math homework. "Dad, yeah? Are you going to go back?" Ethan was silent for a few seconds. "Maybe. Do you want to?" He looked out the glass door where the Portland rain was streaking down over the city. Then he answered, with complete honesty, "I don't know." In the end, Ethan agreed, but only in part. For only 90 days, as a systems transition consultant, and he laid out 4 conditions, the entire infrastructure had to be transparently restructured. The night shift engineering team had to be protected from being overworked. No one would be forced to stay for 46 consecutive hours like he had been ever again. And SterlingGate had to establish a fund to support employees who were taking care of young children. The board agreed almost immediately. Perhaps for the first time in years, the company truly understood the cost of treating people like replaceable parts. The evening Ethan signed the consulting agreement, he left the Marlowe Grand Hotel quite late. The lobby was much quieter than it had been on the day of the emergency meeting. There was only the faint sound of a piano from the lounge and the warm glow of lights reflecting off the marble floor. Victoria Harlan was standing near the glass doors at the front of the hotel. No assistant, no lawyers. She no longer carried the air of a CEO. She turned at the sound of Ethan's footsteps. For a few seconds, they just stood there in silence. Rain fell softly on the street outside. Victoria was the one who finally spoke. "I was wrong." Her cold, corporate voice was gone. So was the commanding tone she was used to. It was just an exhausted human being telling the truth for the first time. Ethan looked at her for a long time. Then he replied quietly, "I know." 3 months later, Portland was settling into the coldest, wettest part of its year. The Ellison Tower still stood downtown, its blue glass reflecting the silver-gray afternoon sky. People in suits still walked through the main lobby, hot coffees in hand. A line of supercars still parked out front every morning. From the outside, SterlingGate Financial looked like it was almost back to normal. At least that's what the company wanted the world to think. But inside on the 31st floor, everything had changed. Old monitors were replaced. The transaction core system was finally being completely rebuilt, instead of just being patched together. Night shift engineers were now forced to take rotating leave. No more 40-hour marathons in front of a server rack just to keep things from collapsing. Claire Donovan became SterlingGate's new director of infrastructure operations. For the first time in years, the operations center no longer ran on fear. Claire still had her habit of drinking cold coffee on the night shift. But now, whenever she saw someone staying too long past their hours, she would walk over and say the exact same thing Ethan had told her years ago. When you're too exhausted to think straight, you're not fixing the system anymore. You're just trying to survive your shift. Initially, the board of directors wanted to rename the entire operations center the Coal Reliability Room. It was a typically corporate way to turn a man into a symbol after they had nearly destroyed his life. Ethan refused immediately. He didn't want his name on a glass wall or a polished brass plaque. In the end, the only thing he agreed to was a small plaque placed in the engineering room behind the central bank of monitors. No logo, no name, just a single simple line. No system is sustainable if the people who keep it alive are treated as replaceable. Claire hung the plaque herself, and almost every new engineer who walked onto the 31st floor found themselves staring at it for longer than they expected. As for Mason Reed, he vanished from SterlingGate almost completely. The investigations dragged on for weeks. Internal emails, falsified logs, and audio recordings finally made their way to federal authorities. A number of class action lawsuits from corporate clients began to surface. The major shareholders tried to keep the scandal from spreading, but in the world of finance, everyone now knew the name Mason Reed. He didn't go to prison, not yet at least. But after the internal and federal investigation concluded, Mason was barred from holding any executive position in the financial technology sector. For a man like Mason, that was almost worse. No more power. No more executive boardrooms. No more dinners with investors at lavish rooftop bars. Just the rest of his life having to live with the fact that he was the one who dragged SterlingGate to the brink. Victoria Harlan also left the corporate world almost immediately after. No big interviews. No podcast about leadership lessons. No attempt to rebuild her image. 3 months later, she was spotted working for a tech ethics nonprofit in Seattle. A small office, no polished glass, no personal assistant, no executive dining room. Some people thought it was her way of cleaning up her image. But it wasn't. Victoria knew some mistakes couldn't be fixed with press releases or image strategies. Some moments stay with you for a very long time. For her, it was the image of Ethan, slumped over in his sleep, surrounded by 27 yellow warning screens. An exhausted father. A man trying to keep both a system and his family from collapsing. And she had seen a lack of professionalism. That was what Victoria couldn't forgive herself for. As for Ethan Cole, he was still living in the same old apartment in East Portland. The taillight on the Subaru Outback was still broken. The heater in the apartment still shuddered in the middle of the night, and Lily still left her shoes by the door. No matter how many times Ethan reminded her. Some things hadn't changed. Maybe that was a good thing. Ethan completed his 90 days of consulting, then left SterlingGate, just as he'd promised. The board wanted him to stay longer. They offered more shares, more money, more power. But Ethan understood something that many on the 44th floor never did. There are things that, if you trade them away for too long, you eventually forget why you were holding on to them in the first place. One late November afternoon, Ethan was driving to pick Lily up from school in the familiar, cold Portland rain. The city was submerged in a soft gray, the yellow streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. The Subaru cut through downtown on the way home. When the car stopped at a red light near the Ellison Tower, Lily looked out the window. The building was lit up, same as always. The 31st floor still cast a pale blue glow from the operations center behind the glass. Lily stared at it for a few seconds, then added, "Yeah? Did you win?" Ethan was quiet. The windshield wipers swept across the glass, slow and steady. He looked at the building for a long time, at the glass panes reflecting the night rain. At the 31st floor, where he'd once fallen asleep surrounded by warning screens, while the entire company thought he was just some obsolete replaceable engineer. Finally, Ethan gave a slight shake of his head. Not really. Lily turned to look at her dad. Then what happened? Ethan looked at his daughter for a few seconds, then said very quietly, "I just didn't let them lie about me." Lily considered this with the solemn gravity of a child, then quietly took her father's hand. The traffic light turned green. The old Subaru pulled away from the intersection into the Portland rain. No loud music, no glorious victory, no speeches. Just the sound of the rain on the windshield, the steady rhythm of the wipers in the dark, and a father who was finally getting to go home on time. And maybe the most terrifying thing about SterlingGate was never the system that nearly collapsed. It was the fact that a $100 million empire had grown so used to one man quietly exhausting himself to keep everything running, that they began to think it was normal. Ethan Cole didn't save the world. He didn't become a millionaire. No press conferences called him a hero. He was just a single father, trying to get home in time to pick up his daughter from school, while the company behind him was slowly burning from the inside out. And that's the kind of strength people don't see until it's too late. If this story reminds you of someone who is quietly shouldering too much, someone no one seems to notice, be kinder to them while you still have the chance. Because some people never complain. They just endure in silence until the day they disappear. And only then does the entire system realize just how important they were.